Good morning and welcome back to Engineered Coffee. It's Sunday, the 23rd of August, 2026. It's time for another Coffee Buzz weekly, where we take 5 stories moving through the coffee industry and work out what they actually mean, without taking 20 minutes to say something that could have been said in 2. This week we have earthquakes, El Nino, a huge Brazilian crop, a coffee species you may not have heard of, and regenerative farming, and 2 very different strategies playing out in the global coffee shop business. And as usual, we'll finish off with a coffee fact, a coffee number, and a coffee myth. So let's get into it. Story number 1, Colombia, earthquake or El Nino. Colombia has had a rough couple of weeks. A powerful earthquake caused significant damage and disruption across parts of the country, with thousands of families displaced. But from a coffee perspective, the immediate earthquake damage appears relatively contained. The bigger concern may actually be what comes next, El Nino. Current forecasts now point to a greater than 90% chance of a very strong El Nino event during 2026-2027. And that matters enormously for coffee. Colombia has been producing around 13.7 million bags, but forecasts suggest production could fall towards 12.5 million bags, roughly an 8% reduction. And Colombia is not alone. Vietnam and Indonesia are particularly exposed because strong El Nino conditions can bring hotter, drier weather to Southeast Asia. Together, those 2 countries produce roughly half of the world's Robusta coffee. Brazilian Arabica may initially get more favorable weather, but the danger comes later if the pattern develops into a drought. So the headline may have been the Colombian earthquake. For the coffee industry, the story we may still be talking about 12 months from now is El Nino. Story number 2, Brazil's huge harvest is taking its time. Meanwhile, Brazil is producing a very different coffee story. Brazil is heading towards an enormous crop. Earlier forecasts suggested the country could achieve record production and record exports during the crop year that began in July. But harvesting itself has been slightly slower than usual. The crop is now around 90% harvested, compared with approximately 97% at the same point last year. Arabica is sitting at roughly 86% complete. But there's another interesting number buried underneath the harvest story. Brazilian soluble coffee exports have risen around 20%, reaching approximately 8,161 tons. But that's worth watching, because Brazil isn't simply the world's giant green coffee supplier. Increasingly, producing countries are interested in capturing more of the value after the coffee leaves the farm. Instead of exporting only the raw material, you process it, roast it, extract it, turn it into soluble coffee, and suddenly considerable more of the value chain stays in the producing country. Story number 3. Coffee has more than 2 species. Ask most coffee drinkers about coffee species, and they'll probably give you 2 answers, Arabica and Robusta. But there are more, and one of them is beginning to attract serious attention, Excelsa. Blue Bottle has recently been highlighting Excelsa coffees, which is interesting because climate pressure is forcing the industry to look beyond the varieties and species we've traditionally relied upon. Excelsa can produce a very different cup profile, often fruity, tart, and complex. But the really interesting part isn't whether Excelsa replaces Arabica. It won't. The interesting question is whether coffee future becomes more biologically diverse. For decades, we've built an enormous global industry around a surprisingly narrow genetic base. Climate change makes that increasingly risky. So perhaps the coffee shop of the future won't simply ask Arabica or Robusta. There may be a third answer on the menu, Excelsa. And let's get on to story number 4. 300,000 farmers and regenerative coffee. Sustainability language changes incredibly quickly. First, we talked about sustainable farming, then carbon neutral, then climate positive. Now, one of the biggest phrases in agriculture is regenerative farming. The difference is important. Instead of simply trying to reduce the damage agriculture causes, regenerative agriculture attempts to improve the soil and farming ecosystem itself. UCC and IDH-backed programs are among incentives pushing regenerative coffee practices throughout the coffee growing regions, with programs targeting hundreds of thousands of farmers. One of the headline ambitions being discussed is around 300,000 farmers by 2030. For coffee, this could mean better soil health, improved water retention, more biodiversity, and potentially farms that are more resilient to extreme weather. And with El Nino sitting at the top of today's show, resilience suddenly doesn't sound like corporate sustainability jargon. It sounds like basic risk management. Story number 5. 2 very different bets on the future of coffee shops. Finally, 2 companies are demonstrating very different approaches to growth. Starbucks continues to simplify its organization and chase efficiency, with another round of restructuring and a broader drive aimed at roughly $2 billion in efficiencies. At the same time, Asian coffee businesses such as Comida are continuing to look towards Southeast Asian expansion. And there's an interesting extra piece of news this morning. Blank Street Coffee has just raised $75 million from investors, including General Atlantic. The 6-year-old chain now operates more than 100 stores, primarily in London and New York, and intends to expand onto the US West Coast while moving into products beyond traditional coffee, including ice cream. The funding reportedly values the company at around $650 million. That tells us something interesting. Investors haven't lost faith in coffee shops. They're simply becoming much more selective about which coffee shop model they believe will win. The traditional giants are trying to become leaner. Asian brands are expanding. And younger companies are trying to redefine what a coffee shop actually sells. That battle is going to be fascinating to watch. And here is today's coffee fact. Coffee isn't actually a bean. What we call a coffee bean is technically the seed of the coffee fruit, commonly called a coffee cherry. There are 2 seeds inside each cherry. So the next time somebody tells you they're a coffee expert because they buy expensive beans, you can ruin their morning by telling them they're actually drinking roasted coffee fruit seeds. Next up is the coffee number. Today's number is 50%. Vietnam and Indonesia together account for roughly half of the global Robusta production. That's why this week's El Nino story matters so much. A weather event affecting one region of Southeast Asia can quickly become a supply problem for instant coffee, espresso blends, and millions of single-serve products around the world. And the coffee myth of the week. The myth is dark roast coffee contains more caffeine than light roast because it tastes stronger. Not necessarily. The darker flavor comes from the roasting chemistry, not from additional caffeine being created. Roasting doesn't magically add caffeine, and depending on whether you're measuring your coffee by weight or by scoop, the answer can actually move slightly in either direction, because darker beans lose more mass and become less dense during roasting. So, stronger taste does not automatically mean more caffeine. And that's this week's Coffee Buzz Weekly. The story I'm watching most closely is El Nino. Coffee can deal with changing consumer trends, new packaging rules, and another fashionable matcha drink, but it can't negotiate with the weather. If the forecasts are right, 2027 could become a very interesting year for coffee supply and coffee prices. I'll see you next week on Engineered Coffee, and until then, keep drinking good coffee.